Hi, everybody. We'd like to thank you for attending this session to go over our PRD, the reporting of records. You have a lot of things to do in your day, and we very much appreciate you being here. Just real quick, I'm going to let you know who's on the call. Our PRD team. We have Pamela Scott. We have Scott McLean filling in for your assistant program manager. And we have Julie Powell as well. If I know this was already mentioned, but if you guys do have questions, we're going to save those for the most part till the end, so we can try to get to all of them. And we are using the Q&A function again, just to reiterate. I'll hand it over to your program manager, Chris Morris. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy and Cindy. Appreciate it. And yeah, like Amy said, hey, thanks so much for joining us this morning. I know for some of you, it might be just getting your day started. So thanks a ton for joining in. We hope to give you a lot of really useful content today. It's going to be kind of a lot to cover. I'm going to try really hard to save some time for questions at the end. We always try to allow for that. But that being said, let's just go ahead and get started in the presentation a little bit here. Amy already went through and talked a bit about who's actually on the call today. I wanted to give you this slide so you'll have the names and such of who's involved. By the way, this presentation file will be posted probably next week at prd.fa.gov. I know it's hard to take notes and things while you're watching a presentation like this. And I think it'd be useful, if you could just download the presentation file. So we'll have that as a PDF document for you next week. If you jump over to prd.fa.gov, there will also be some web links and things that I'll show you today, mostly towards the end. And those are obviously very hard to use if you're just looking at them on screen. So that's another reason to download this presentation, because then the web links and things will work. And of course, you have the names. My name is Chris Morris. I'm the PRD program manager. Stacy Smith is the assistant program manager. And then we have the rest of the PRD support team on the call today to answer questions and things during the presentation. We already mentioned that there is a Q&A box where you can submit your questions, and your questions will either be answered by the support team during the presentation, like they'll reply back in the Q&A box. Some questions may be answered at the end of the presentation. And then if we just aren't able to get to your question because of time, or maybe it's requires some research or whatever, then that'll probably be next week. You will get a response by email. Okay, so that's kind of how we're gonna run that. So let's talk about what's going to be on the docket today. So of course, this is about reporting pilot records, and we're going to go into some of the details about who has to report records, what records are we talking about, when are these records required to be reported, and then how do you actually do it? So we're covering quite a bit today, and you can think of this as a general overview of the reporting record requirement. We will have future webinars that will really dig down into very specific records, like training records or drug and alcohol records. We'll talk more about those. We will show you a little bit about that today. But this is more about, the total, overview of reporting records. So let's just jump right in. So the first thing to talk about is, well, who has to report pilot records? And there's kind of two questions to answer on this, under the who. There's Part 111 applicability, which we'll start with, and that's, what type of operators are required to report pilot records? So we'll hit that one first. And then of course, there's kind of the technical question about what kind of user roles do I need to have in the PRD system to be able to report pilot records? So we're going to address both of those here a little bit to kind of give you an idea. But let's start with Part 111 applicability. So starting June 10th, which is Friday, it's like right here. Starting June 10th, these types of operators are required to begin reporting pilot records. Now, their requirements aren't all identical, and we'll go into that a little bit. It varies, like what types of records and things you have to report varies a little bit. But super high level, we're talking about Part 121 air carriers, Part 135, air carriers and operators. Part 125, that does include the 125 LOTA holders. If you have a letter of deviation, you're still included. If you have been kind of fishing around Part 111 and you're like, well, I didn't see 125 LOTA holders. Well, they've actually kind of lumped them in with the Part 91 folks. I just didn't quite set it up the same way in the slide, but it's in there. And then Part 91K operators are also included. Finally, the last two, air tour operators. Those are operators operating under 91.147. And then corporate operators, which I know that really can mean a big, massive, it's kind of undefined, but Part 111 does clarify what we mean when we say corporate operators. So we're talking about Part 91 operators who operate 2 or more type-rated aircraft or turbine-powered rotorcraft, and also in furtherance of a business. Okay, so if you meet all 3 of those characteristics, then you would be required to report certain pilot records to the PRD. So that's the super high level about who has to report. And now, as far as the other question, well, technically, what do I need in the PRD system to report pilot records? So let's talk about that one just for a second. So the role that we have to report pilot records is called the authorized user contributor. And I know it sounds a little funny. It almost would read better if we stuck a hyphen between user and contributor, but that's just not the way it shows up in the website. But anyway, so you have to have an authorized user contributor role in the PRD system to be able to add pilot records. You register for this role via the PRD website, just as you may have registered for other roles, like maybe you are an authorized consumer. That process that you went through to request that consumer role is exactly the same as requesting the authorized user contributor. So your request to register is handled at your local office, like within your company. The FAA doesn't get involved in approving or processing those authorized user contributor requests. So it does happen there in your company, and it can either be approved by your authorized responsible person can approve you, or if you have a user manager, they could also approve you. So that happens, locally is, I guess, kind of the point. If you are an authorized responsible person, or perhaps a proxy authorized responsible person, then you will automatically get this user contributor role, this authorized contributor role. You don't have to register for it. So that's good. So hopefully that'll be, helpful. And if you're looking, if you looked this week or you're trying to look today and you're like, well, I don't even see this role. Well, the application is being updated actually today. They're rolling out the software update that will facilitate this. So if you tried this process maybe a couple of days ago and you couldn't find the way to register, it's because it wasn't turned on, essentially. Okay, but that should be up and running, I would say tomorrow, right? Because today they're updating software. So let's just say tomorrow it should be available for registrations and things. So that kind of covers the basic roles that you need, from a technical perspective. So the next question I want to address is what records have to be reported? And, because pilot records, that's kind of an open-ended definition, right? So there's 2 general characteristics of records that help you decide if they need to be reported or not. So we'll talk about that and kind of explain how you can kind of figure it out. So the first characteristic is, what type of record is this? Is it a particular training record? Is it an HR record? There's a lot of examples. You have to look to AC 12068 Juliet for the list of records that are reportable. There's an appendix in the back that specifies, and it has it broken out by different types of operations. Like it'll say if you're, a corporate operator, you report these records. If you're a part 91, if you're a 91K operator, you report these records. So you have to find your type of operation in the appendices, and then it'll tell you what type of records apply. So that's the first question is you just see if the record is in the list, and then okay, that's one that I have to report to PRD. And the other question is, what is the age of the record? How far back does it go? That sort of thing. So once you consider those two things, and we'll talk more about the age here in just a minute. Once you address those two things, then that helps you figure out, what gets reported. So it's not everything. That's maybe a good statement to get out front. It's not every record that you have is reportable. The general idea is the FAA is looking for records that offer value to the potential employer, right? So that's the idea behind it. So that kind of covers the what. So let's keep talking about what types of records are actually included. So there is a table in the AC 12068 Juliet. It's table 2-2. I'm going to go ahead and show you the table here. I know it's probably a lot to read, and I don't really expect you to read it all here. I just want to give you a real quick highlight how it's kind of laid out. So this is in the AC, of course, you should go check it out. But as you can see across the left-hand edge, there's all the different types of operators that I mentioned a few slides back. So you just find what row applies to you, okay? And so, if you're an air tour operator or you're a public aircraft operator, whatever, so you find the row, and then it outlines, as you read across to the right, what type of records that you're expected to report. And so generally high level, we're talking about drug and alcohol records, training, qualification, and proficiency records, final disciplinary action records, records concerning separation of employment, and finally verification that you completed the vehicle driving search and evaluation, if applicable. So, so those are like the super high level 5 types of records. And if you want to know, well, exactly what are we talking about when you say training, qualification, and proficiency records, you need to refer to the appendices in AC 12068 Juliet, because that's where it's going to tell you. Okay, so let's see. The next thing I want to talk about is the age of the records. So there's kind of 2 very important definitions here about, how you figure out. Well, let me just start off with the 2 basic definitions that are really important to kind of get when we talk about the age of the records. So there's a really important date that you should just kind of have in your head, and that's June 9 and June 10, right there in that little switch over. So any records that are before June 10th, before Friday, so June 9th, going backwards in time, as far back as August 1st, 2010. So it's pretty far back. So all the way back to 2010 for some operators, and actually for a few other air carriers, it goes back as far as August 1st, 2005. But that time frame of records, we collectively call historical pilot records. Okay, so when you're in this presentation, or you're looking at the AC, or you're looking at the regulation, and it talks about historical pilot records, that's what we mean. It's anything dated June 9 and back, and how far back you go. It kind of depends on your operation, but we'll look at that. And then, of course, the other side of the coin is June 10th and forward. So any records dated June 10 and moving into the future, we refer to as new pilot records, just collectively. Okay, so really important that you understand that June 10th kind of demarcation line, because it'll help you a ton to understand what are historical records and what are new pilot records. So that's a real important one. So now we've kind of got that established. The actual age that you have to report, is it back to 2005, or is it just back to 2010, or is it even any historical records at all? Well, it completely depends on what type of operation you're involved. The AC has another table. I mentioned table 2-2 just a second ago. It has another table that's meant to help you kind of figure out what age group that applies to your operation. So this is an excerpt of the table 2-1. And the best way to sort of look at this table, because it's laid out a little bit different, is you can see across the top, it has the different types of operators. They're grouped together a little bit more here because a lot of them have very similar requirements. And then across the left-hand side, there's a column that says record documentation date. So we have the first cell that I've highlighted there, and that's records from 2005 to 2010. So these are the super, super old ones. This is that little bit I showed you on the previous slide. So we're talking really old historical records. And if you look to the right, you'll see it says must report, or it says NA, not applicable, not applicable. So that's where it sort of indicates what type of operators have to report, what age. And of course, there's another group, which is the first group I showed you, which is records June 9th, going backwards all the way to August 1st, 2010. And if you look to the right, you can see who has to report those. And then, of course, the last definition we looked at was what we call new pilot records. And you can see here that essentially everybody that we've talked about, all the different types of operators, they have to report new pilot records starting anything dated on June 10th or after. Okay, so hopefully that will help you sort of figure out, which records that you actually need to report. Now, this is a slightly different view of the same information. It's just, I hope that this maybe is just helpful to some of you. And so I'll kind of explain it, but basically imagine you have all these different types of operators. We've already talked about these folks, and you're reporting pilot records to the PRD system. And then we have the 3 different ages of records, right? We have in the blue box there, we have the really old historical stuff, 2005 to 2010. And then in the orange box, we have still historical records, but not quite as far back. They just go to 2010 to 2022. And then in the green box, we have the new pilot records. And so the only thing I've done here is I've just marked the different types of operators with this color code. So you can find by whatever type of operation that you are, you can look at this and say, oh, well, I have an orange dot and a green dot. And so you can see what age applies to you. So this is the same thing as table 2-1. It's just been kind of reformatted. So hopefully that helps a little bit. So I think that covers the what. Okay, so now we're going to move on and talk about the when. And by when, I mean, when do you have to report certain records? Okay, so let's go into that. So new records is pretty easy, pretty straightforward. And you know what new pilot records are? New pilot records are any record dated on June 10th and moving into the future. Okay, so new pilot records are reportable to PRD within 30 days of creation. There are a few record types that the regulation's a little bit more specific, and it says upon becoming final. And I'll give you an example. Disciplinary action records. Okay. If an airman has a disciplinary action, it's important that that action be final and not subject to any pending appeals or, being investigated or whatever, right? So once you as the operator decide this disciplinary action is final, we've already appealed it, we've talked about it, it's effective, right? So whenever it's decided by you essentially that it's final, then you have to report it, to PRD. But generally the rule of thumb that you can have in your head is within 30 days. Okay. So there is an exception I will just mention here, but I don't want to go into great details. And we call it the PAC exception. And you can look at details in the AC. I have the reference there about, I even gave you the paragraph number so you can jump over there and look at it. But the PAC exception, PAC stands for Public Aircraft Operations, Air Tour, and Corporate. Okay, so if you are a public aircraft operation, or you are an air tour operator, or you're a corporate operator, you do have this PAC exception regarding when you have to report pilot records. And essentially what it says is you can either report the records within 30 days, just like everyone else, or if you want to exercise this option, you can just hold on to certain records for 5 years, and then you only have to actually report the record if you're requested to do so. So if you're a corporate operator and you don't want to report training records to PRD, you could instead just maintain them. And then if your pilot went to another employer in the future, that employer can notify you. It actually comes to you via the PRD system. The PRD system will notify you, hey, this employer needs the records on your pilot. And then you would have to enter them. I think it's within 14 days. Okay, so basically it's intended to reduce burden on the PAC group. So if you think that might be something that you would be interested in exercising, you can of course look at the AC for more details. The regulation also outlines the PAC exception, but that's probably good for this point. I just wanted to give you awareness that it's there. So now historical records, which as you recall, it's any record dated June 9th or older. How far back it goes depends on your operation. So the regulation says that you have to start reporting these records on Friday, June 10th. Now here's kind of the good news. By begin reporting, it just means you have to enter a single record, right? You could enter one record and you would be in compliance with the regulation, because the regulation really doesn't say you must enter X number of records every month or whatever. It doesn't say that. It just says you have to start on Friday. And then it says you have to finish reporting kind of more recent historical records a year from now. Okay, so you have a whole year to enter the historical records. And by more recent, by the way, let me just clarify that. More recent, it's basically historical stuff back to 2015. Okay, so so essentially you have between now and next June to report historical records going back to 2015. Okay, so but it's kind of up to you how you time that, how you arrange that. So we leave that up to you. And then if you have any other historical records, like stuff that's older than 2015, going back to whatever oldest date applies to your operation. Okay, the older stuff has to be finished up in NPRD by September 2024. Okay, so you have a little over 2 years to get all of that historical stuff reported. Okay, now keep in mind that while you're doing all this historical reporting, the new record reporting is still in place, right? That runs alongside. It's a parallel activity. Okay, so now we're getting down to the how of, how do you enter these pilot records? Okay, there's generally 2 ways to do it. There's a web-based form at the website. We also refer to that sometimes as the manual system or the web-based system. Okay, so the web-based system is available to everyone that needs to report records. It's available to you, and it will be active by Friday, probably really tomorrow. Like I mentioned at the top of the webinar, they're doing these updates, right now, actually. Now, the other method of reporting pilot records is going to be via an application program interface, or API for short. And this might be really useful to those of you that use electronic record keeping systems, because that way you don't have to actually go to a website and type in information to report these records. You're going to see in a second how reporting actually works on the web-based form. Okay, so you'll get a sense of that. But if you have an awful lot of records and they're stored in an electronic record keeping system, wouldn't it make sense if you could just, electronically transmit those things up to PRD? So that functionality is in development. It's not available today. It will not be available on Friday. There is an API in development, and the general schedule for the API is we anticipate releasing the API standards in September of this year. So September, if you're interested in this reporting method, is when we should have some technical documents released to you so that you can start to look at the technical interface requirements, and you can look at your data and say, is it in the right format? How do I actually use the API? Okay, so that'll be September. And then we anticipate the API actually being online and functioning in December. Okay, so the soonest that you can anticipate being able to upload records would be December via the API. So you might find yourself needing to use the manual web-based system until the API comes up, right? And for historical records, like if you're an API operator, let's just call it that way. Like if you plan to use the API, well, historical records are pretty easy, because if you just do one via the web-based form, then you can sort of pause that, right, until December comes around. And then you would still have another 6 months to push up those historical records via the API. So that's a pretty good plan. We recognize it's a little bit harder for those of you that want to use the API, but you have this requirement starting on Friday to report new pilot records within 30 days. So, you're going to have to start reporting those no later than July 10th, right? That's 30 days. So July 10th, the API won't be ready. So you're going to be, unfortunately, you're going to have to use the web-based form for a little bit. But we realize that's super important to a lot of you folks. And so we're trying to get that out as fast as we can. So that's the API part. Of course, today, I'm just going to show you the web-based form, and we'll just kind of do that scenario. So let's go ahead and get into that, so we can go through how it looks on the website. And this is high level. We will have additional webinars that will drill more deeply into, the actual forms and, the different options and all that stuff. It's too much to cover in this webinar. We wouldn't have enough time to cover all this kind of general stuff. But anyway, let's get into the high level. So there's two things I'm going to show you in this high level demonstration. I'm going to show you how to make an employment record entry, because that's one of the types of records you have to report. And I'm also going to show you a sample how to report a training record. Okay, so these are both very common record types, and we'll kind of do a scenario so you can see what that looks like. I will apologize that these screenshots, they have some redacted data on it. The data that's redacted is it's test information, but there could be some weird coincidence where it ends up being, like it could match someone's name or an operator name or whatever, just by coincidence. And so just to be safe, we redacted the pilot names and certificate numbers, even though it's just test data. So I apologize for that. But you're not really missing anything. You're just missing like company names and stuff. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into this. Now, I do want to remind you that AC 12068 is the one that talks about, it will give you more information on the actual program guidance, about PRD, like what records. If you're looking for technical information about, well, how exactly, what do I click on the website to do this? The AC doesn't go into what buttons to click on the website. But we have a lot of documents at prd.fa.gov that are meant to help you with that, actual step-by-step walkthroughs. Okay, so when you finish this presentation and you're like, okay, well, that was sort of informative, but I need to know step-by-step. Go over to our website and you should find those instructions there. Okay. A couple things about reporting. before we start this, I tell you this for Friday, okay, when Friday rolls around, or when you start reporting. So the system that you'll be working in is a live production system. It's not a test system. So records that you report, they should be real records. So I wouldn't just start making up stuff and playing with stuff. I know that's a great way to learn, but it's not helpful in this case because this is a production system. And it's also important to note that these pilot records that you report cannot be deleted. They can be edited by you if you create a record and then you say, oh no, I got the date wrong, or I got the activity wrong, or whatever. You can go in there and change it, but you can't delete pilot records. Okay. There is a suppression system, which is beyond the scope of this webinar, but suppression basically means the record is hidden, but it's still there. It's not deleted. So if you'll just keep that in mind come Friday, if you want to start playing around with it. Okay. So let's go through the process. So what we're going to do is we're going to practice recording a couple of these records. So of course you start from prd.faa.gov, and there is a button there that says tools. That's the way that you start this whole process of reporting pilot records. So you'll click on the tools button. You'll be prompted with the new My Access updated web page. If you have an account at PRD, but you haven't been there since, I think, mid-May, I forget the exact date that this changed. If you haven't been there since mid-May, you will need to reset your password because they made an update to the software. And the way that I don't have it marked here on the slide, but see where it says at the bottom, need help signing in. If you click there, you're going to see a reset password option. If you get stuck, just email us and we'll send you the directions how to reset your password. But anyway, that's not really the point of this webinar, so I won't really go into it. So you fill in your username, which is probably your email, and then you hit next. And then of course, it's going to ask you for your password and your multi-factor, and then you'll log in. So once you get logged in to PRD, this is the role selection page, and you need to select the authorized user contributor role. You might have other roles that you have in this system. So you just select whatever role that you want to do. And then of course you need to select your AirTagger name. Some people have roles for multiple operators. That's why you have this drop-down list. Okay. If you just have one operator, you'll just see the one. But anyway, so, and then you hit select, and then it's going to log you into the system sort of with that mindset of this is what you're going to work on. So when you first log in, you'll arrive on what we call the inbox. This is where there's generally, you might see messages to you, system messages, things that you might need to do or whatever. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the pilot search menu, because we're going to look up the pilot that we need to report records for, and then we'll report records. So you click on pilot search, and that takes you to the pilot search page, which looks like this. It's not horribly complicated. You just need to fill out the pilot certificate number, and you can do last name. You can do first name instead if you want, and that might be really handy. I point that out because think of scenarios like maybe you're reporting historical records and maybe the pilot's name has changed over time. Like, maybe people get married or whatever. So you might find that useful, that you can search by certificate number and first name, or you can do certificate number and last name, but you have to do one of the names. Okay. And when you fill that in and you hit the search button, it's actually going to search for current existing pilots in the FAA system, right? Because it's really important that your record that you're reporting gets matched to an actual airman. Okay, so that's why it does that. So you can see now here at the bottom of the screen, I get the search results based on what I searched for, and it did find a pilot. I know, I'm sorry for the redacting, but I explained why we did that. You can see it did find a commercial pilot, and it has their name and certificate number. Of course, you can look at that and say, yep, that's the right person I was looking for. And then you hit the view button, And then that actually opens the reporting page. So you can think of this as you've now established your pilot. You know which pilot you're reporting for. And so it would be most efficient to report lots of records for the same person, if that makes sense. You wouldn't want to switch people a lot because that's just kind of inefficient. Anyway, so this is how the page loads, and it loads on the employment screen by default. And this is where you'll see any existing employment records that you have entered. Again, these are just going to be records that you provided as an operator. I don't mean you personally. I mean for whatever company for which you work. Okay. So you'll see the records there. And I have a little note to scroll down for the reporting form. You can't see it in this page, but if you scroll down in the page, you will see the actual form where you could enter a new employment record, or you could edit a record. And I'm not going to go into great detail here. We'll talk about it when we do the detail webinars, but generally you would only have one employment record, and I'll kind of show you why it kind of makes sense, right? So if you scroll down, this is what you see. And I'll pause here for a second so you can sort of take a look. You have a few fields, like there's PRD date of hire. And that basically means, when did you start training, for example, when did you, onboard them? Complete date and final records date. We'll talk more about these when we do our detail webinar, but these are pretty useful to other employers because the complete date is like, let's say that you are entering a bunch of pilot records and you get them all updated. You get everything current and PRDs up to date. You can put a date there that tells others that, hey, we've entered all this pilot's records up to today. And that becomes useful down the road. And then the final records date, what that's for is if you have a pilot who no longer works for you and you're working on putting in these historical records, well, when you finish reporting all the records and PRDs like complete, and there's no more records coming because they don't work for you, right? They've left, they've gone somewhere else. Then you can enter a date there under final records date. And that basically signals to other employers that you've entered everything and you don't have any other records to report. So that's helpful as well. Anyway, so to kind of give you an idea, so you could fill in the date of hire. That one's required to make any kind of record reports here. And then you could enter other stuff just as it applies. Like there's a separation item there. Anyway, so you fill that out and you hit save, and then you're going to see the record shows up in that table back at the top of the screen. So it's really pretty straightforward. Pretty simple process. And you can also edit records. If you just select the little box next to the record that you want to edit, then you can hit the edit button and it just pulls it back up again, right? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Pulls it back up. You can change the information, update it. That's why I was saying that you might find that you, as an operator, you kind of only expect to have one employer record there. You could do multiples. The system won't stop you, but it's kind of not really a whole lot of point to that because you can edit it. You might find that multiple is appropriate if the pilot works for you and then the pilot leaves and goes to another employer for a couple of years. Maybe that's an example. And then they come back again, then it might make sense to have another employer record. But anyway, super straightforward. There's really no big tricks to that. So here you could edit whatever you needed to change and then click update, and it's going to update the information. So that's just kind of how entering an employment record works, just high level, And like I said, we're going to do more detail on this process in future webinars. Just for time's sake, we didn't go into it here. I do want to show you another example, and that's how to report a training record, because I know a lot of folks are interested in that one. So the way you do this is you click the training tab, which is in the menu up there. You click training, and that opens the training page, and it will show you automatically a table of all the training records that you have reported for this pilot. And that's helpful. You know, if you're like, well, wait, did I already do this one? I can't remember, you know, then you could just look it up and you would see, oh yeah, I already reported that one. Okay. So that takes you there. And just like the other page, if you scroll down on the page is where you will see the form to report additional records. It's kind of hidden, right? I can't show you here. So you scroll down and then you'll see an empty area to add a training record. So let me show you this one because I think it'll help to give you an idea of what this looks like. So the first thing that you might have noticed is you're not uploading records. You're not scanning your documents, you know, and sending it up to PRD. You're just recording some key facts about the record. So let's look at this one just to kind of give me an idea how it works. So let's look at the field. So you have a start date, and that's just, you know, whatever date the record is dated. You know, if it's a single event that starts and ends on the same date, then you would just put that date. If it's a type of an event that took a while, you know, maybe it's a training curriculum, like, you know, NDOC or something, then you could put the day that class started or the program started, and then you could put the date that the program was completed. So hopefully that's not too complicated. And then there's a box for aircraft make and model. This is a box that as you start typing, it will give you a bunch of choices. Okay, so you type in LR-60, you'll get anything that matches that aircraft. Okay, and there is a list. You see it says view list. That opens up another window and allows you to kind of browse through how's the list arranged. I'm going to give you a really good tip that I hope helps a lot of you. If you're struggling to find how is your aircraft, you know, how is it labeled in PRD? Because sometimes, you know, there's different abbreviations or whatever. This list matches your operation specifications. All right. It's the same abbreviations is what I mean. So if you are looking for a Challenger and you're not sure how it's spelled or whatever in this list, if you just look at your op specs, you'll and see, oh, how is Challenger listed in my op specs? Then you're going to see it. And that's the exact same code that PRD expects. So hopefully that's helpful. Then it asks you for the duty position. There's only two choices, PIC and SIC. Then it's going to ask you for the training and testing programs. That's where you just pick what kind of program it was that this was under. And then of course the training event. And by the way, these options will change based on, you know, what you pick. Like if you pick, you know, a 121 N&O program or whatever, that's going to change the options for training event, if that makes sense. And then you have an option for reporting whether the event was satisfactory, which is the same as complete, or was it unsatisfactory, which is also the same as incomplete. Okay, we use those two terms here in PRD. So you would just pick one of those two. And then some events will allow you to record evaluator comments. Some events will not. So you might pick a different event and there is no evaluator comment box because this doesn't apply. And this evaluator comments, it's not your comments. This is if, like on the training record, the evaluator, the check pilot made comments about the performance, that would need to be copied verbatim right into that box. That's what that's about. Anyway, so that's kind of how that goes. And then you hit save and then it adds it to the record, right? It shows up in that table just above. And just like before, you could, you know, you could edit stuff if you made a mistake or whatever, but there's no delete. Okay. So you can't delete any of these guys. Okay. And there, it reminds you. Okay. And I did mention suppression, you know, that is a function available to you guys where you can suppress a record, but it just sort of hides it, but it's still in the system. So that wraps up our demo. I do want to offer these resources. Again, these are web links. And if you download the PDF file, then this will be much more useful to you than just looking at it on screen. The thing I really want to highlight is there is almost there at the bottom, how to report records guide. That's a step-by-step how to report records. So that may be super helpful. It goes into a lot more detail than what this presentation does. So if you need that sort of information, which I'm sure a lot of people are looking for it, that's where you can get it. It's basically at our website. It's at prd.faa.gov. Okay. So we do have another webinar on June 16th. It's essentially this presentation. It's the same one in case you couldn't attend or you want to see it again, or maybe you have some coworkers that would like to see it. Please let folks know about our next webinar. And then we have the complete schedule at prd.faa.gov. You will see additional webinars soon that go into like deep dive, and we're also going to offer more presentations for pilots that describe, how do I add employers and how do I request corrections to my pilot records? How do I dispute pilot records? All of that stuff is important to explain to pilots. So we'll cover that in future webinars, but they'll all be listed there. So that takes us down to the question section. We have about 14 minutes to see if there are any questions. I'm going to ask Scott, one of our PRD support folks, to pick out a few questions. And Scott, if you'll ask the question out loud, and then I will do my best to answer it. So do we have any questions in there, Scott?
Yeah. So first question, should the NDR record 8060-13 be reported, or should the state-specific NVR also be reported?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just to paraphrase what I heard, Scott. So the question is, do we report the 8060-13 or any records you get in response to a -13, which is the National Driver Register request? Do you report any of that to PRD? And the short answer is no. You do not report any NDR records. You don't enter any of them into the PRD system. PRD is pretty limited when it comes to NDR related content. The only content regarding NDR that is in PRD is when you as an operator have completed the NDR review, like request and review or evaluation of the NDR data. When you finish that process, then you report the date that you've completed that to the PRD system. I didn't show it in the demo, but there's a tab up there that says NDR. I think it says NDR, and you click there, and the only option available is a date code. You just put the date in. So, so I hope that answers that question. Anything else, Scott?
Yep. Table 2-1 has 2 columns for requirements that include Part 135. They found this confusing, and they're asking if one is scheduled or one is unscheduled, or just what is the difference between those?
I think you're asking about, there's a difference in Part 135 air carriers and Part 135 operators. I think that's where the question's going. And it has to do whether they operate interstate or intrastate. The requirements, the requirements of each operator type are a little bit different, but really from a PRD perspective, they're very similar. It's just the difference. I think I'm thinking now exactly what the difference is. That's going to be helpful for you folks. And that is, so under PREA, which is, PREA, the Pilot Records Improvement Act, we've had since 1997. PREA applied to air carriers. So if you had an air carrier certificate hanging on your wall, if you were a 121 or a 135 air carrier, then PREA applied to you. But there are a few 135 operators that are technically not air carriers. And and give me a little leeway on this. I'm not an expert in the subject, but I think that's the difference you're looking for. So what that ends up meaning is that if you're an air carrier, you have an older record set, older historical records back to 2005, Whereas if you're a 135 operator, you might not have them back that far. If I didn't answer that to your satisfaction, please send that one in to us at prd_support@fa.gov, and I can do a little more homework on it and give you a better answer. But I think I got that pretty close, Scott.
All right. Previously, flight checks reported on 8410-3 were only required to be maintained for 14 months. All 8410-3 forms older than 14 months will have been discarded. Does the requirement to report take this into consideration?
Yeah, I'm not really familiar with that form number, but I think I can still answer the question. So when the law came out in 2010 from Congress that required creation of the pilot records database, which I didn't mention that because we had that in a previous webinar, but that's why we have PRD, as Congress wrote a statute about it, requiring the FAA to build this database. So when Congress wrote that law, it indicated that the PRD will contain, all pilot records in existence in people's hands effective August 1st, 2010. That's kind of where that date came from. So what that created at that moment was a requirement for operators to cease destroying records if you happen to be destroying records. It created sort of a superseded record requirement that says, oh, well, because of this new law, we have to keep all these records because they have to go into PRD when the database is ready. So the agency did make a lot of effort to notify industry and the applicable operators about this requirement, because we get not everyone reads the Federal Register every morning, which is where that was published back in 2010. But so the agency has made a lot of efforts over the years to remind folks that, hey, don't forget, you got to hold on to these records, because you're right, there are other record keeping timelines that are shorter than 2010 or 2005. But any record can be subject to multiple record keeping timelines. And so the trick is just to say, oh, okay, well, which one's longest? And we'll keep the record. So I hope that answers the question. It may not answer what do we do if we didn't keep the record. I can't really answer that one in this webinar format, but hopefully that addresses the question.
All right, next question. What is the reasoning behind not being able to delete a record?
Yeah, good question. A lot of it comes from the IT folks. A lot of it comes from them and their suggestions. A lot of it comes from our office, AFS 600, deciding what's the appropriate way to handle records. And, lots of scenarios were considered, and it was decided at the end of the day, the best plan of attack is not to allow deletion of records. A lot of that has to do with, auditing purposes or disputes or arguments, civil litigation, who knows, right? I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in the future and how that might become a critical piece of information, So not being able to predict the future, it makes more sense to say, okay, we're not going to allow deleting of records, but we do allow suppressing. And suppressing, which I'm going to explain a little bit more because I think you'll find that it's pretty much just as good for all practical intents and purposes. If you suppress a record, the pilot cannot see it, because the pilot can log in. You may not have known this. A pilot can log in and they can see whatever records you've reported on them. Okay. They can do that whenever they want. But if it's suppressed, the pilot won't see it. No one can see it. It's not released to anyone. It's there, but it's no longer accessible to anyone but you, the company who reported it. So, and the good news, it can be undone, right? Because what if you deleted a bunch of records? Like, oh no, we didn't mean to do that. Well, so if you suppress a record and you go, oh no, we didn't mean to suppress that, you can unsuppress it. You can bring it back. So that's some of the explanation why.
Will we need to enter records or pilots we know to be deceased?
Yeah, great question. It's a little bit of a complicated answer. So the and I might need to, maybe I'll tag this one for review so I can research it and make sure I'm answering this correctly, but I'm going to take a stab at it. The regulation says, I'm paraphrasing, that you don't have to report a record if the pilot is known to be 99 years old or older. Okay, because so the statute says that the records must be kept in the system for the life of the pilot. But the FAA, we're rarely notified that someone dies. So that's not really a reliable indicator for us. So what we do is we say, well, when the pilot is older than 99 years old, we make a decision and assumption that they're deceased, and we can start pulling those records out of PRD. So you no longer have to report records. If you look at your record and you look at and you have the airman's date of birth and you say, oh my gosh, this guy's 102 years old, or, I would have to do the math, right, to see how that fits. But you would not have to report that. But your question was, if you know the airman's deceased, but see, I don't think the regulation addresses that. The regulation, I don't think it says you don't have to report if they're over 99 or you personally know that they're deceased. So I think it would still be reportable in that case, but I reserve the right to look that one up and maybe clarify my answer if I see that I went the wrong direction on it. I think, Scott, we have time for maybe one more. Do you have one more in there?
I've got a bunch in here, but the last one that I have for answering live is, do we need to add all comments even if they're positive?
Yeah, good question. Any comments provided by the check pilot or the evaluator, because it might be an FAA inspector, lots of people do that activity. So any comments provided would need to be reported, even if it's positive, would need to be entered. Because if you think about it, trying to make the decision, like for you as a contributor, trying to make the analysis of, is this positive or is this negative, right? It's not always clear cut. So we don't want you to have to be in that position of trying to weigh this thing and figure out, should I report this or should I not? So from sort of a simplicity perspective at reporting time, we said, plus to be in compliance with the act, with the statute, we said, okay, you'll report all comments in its entirety that are provided by the evaluator for certain events. Again, not every event will allow comments. And then what happens is that comment is then provided to the next employer, and then they get to read the comments and make a decision, right? If you think about it under PREA today, most folks are, when they get a record request, they're photocopying or scanning these check ride forms and then sending them to the new employer, which means the new employer is getting the check ride form in its entirety. And they're also getting all the comments. You see what I'm saying? And people aren't, I hope they're not, people aren't, taking scissors and cutting out the positive comments, right? The new employer gets all the comments, and that's the intention. So I hope that answers that question. That does take us to the top of the hour. I know there may be a lot of outstanding questions, and those that are outstanding remaining will get answered via email. So because we have your email associated to your question, and give us a few days to respond, but I promise we'll respond to all the questions. And I think with that, 11 o'clock, we'll go ahead and stop here. Thanks again for attending. Don't forget about our next webinar, and everybody have a A great day. We'll go ahead and end the presentation here.